Good evening. I want to welcome you to Katharine Hayhoe's lecture, Connecting Global Change to Local Impacts and Solutions. My name is Meg Duguid. I'm the Director of Exhibitions for the Department of Exhibition and Performing and Student Spaces at Columbia College, Chicago. And this is the first program for our Third Coast Disrupted Artists and Scientists on Climate exhibition. It's an exhibition of newly commissioned artworks culminating from a year-long conversation between 7 artists and 7 scientists centered on climate change, their impacts and solutions in the Chicago region. It's a feat to put together an exhibition of newly commissioned works. Then add to that facilitating a discussion among 14 scientists and artists that both acknowledges the very real effects of climate change while focusing on solution-oriented ideas. For this, we have needed a village. This program was created through a collaboration between Columbia College Chicago, DePaul University's Institute for Nature and Culture, and Terracom. We also couldn't have done this without our sponsors and our supporters, especially with the support of the Illinois Arts Council Agency and the Illinois Science and Energy Innovation Foundation. We invite you to join us in person at the exhibition, which is currently on view at the Glass Curtain Gallery in Chicago through October 30th, or come visit us online at thirdcoastdisrupted.org and colum.edu/thirdcoast, where you can learn more about the artists and scientists involved, as well as see future programs. Now, I would like to introduce Christine Esposito, the project director and lead curator of Third Coast Disrupted. She's also the founder of Terracom, a 30-year-old environmental communications firm whose exchange project brings together collaborators to create art science initiatives like Third Coast Disrupted.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We are so thrilled to have Katharine Hayhoe to kick off our first program for Third Coast Disrupted. We're particularly excited because Katharine has been an advisor to this project since its inception more than 6 years ago. So in a way, we're coming full circle this evening by having her. It's my pleasure to introduce her. Katharine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on understanding what climate change means to people and the places where we live. She's an endowed professor at Texas Tech University. She hosts the PBS digital series Global Weirding, and if you haven't seen it, do check it out. And she has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people, the United Nations Champion of the Environment, and the World Evangelical Alliance's Climate Ambassador. This is just a Cliff Notes version of her bio. I hope you will go to katharineHayhoe.com to see the full range of all her many contributions. And now, Katharine Hayhoe.
We are going to be talking about science, since I'm a scientist, but we're going to be talking a little bit about art as well. And we're specifically going to be focusing on how we bring this from the global to the local scale. So let me share my screen with you and we will get started. We have been in quarantine, in lockdown, in social distancing mode now for months. So what is something that you've been doing the last 6 months that it turns out that you really enjoy? Something that you didn't necessarily have time to do before, and you've been doing a lot of it the last 6 months and it's changed your life. All right. Yes, gardening, Zoom, absolutely, for sure. Now, I don't know, the person who wrote Zoom, did you notice the last part of the question? It has to be something that you really enjoy. And if you really enjoy Zoom, you're welcome to come and do a lot of my Zooms for me because I have a list that you could do. Oh, I love this. Okay, gardening. Yes, I've been doing gardening too. Puzzles, painting, piano, organizing, bread. Yes, backpacking, walking, a dollhouse. That's awesome. Journaling, bird watching and birding, YouTube. Yep. Cooking, hiking. Fantastic. I love this. And there's some good ideas too, if you're interested as well. Great. All right. So now you know how this works. So when I ask you questions as we go along, you just go back here and you can answer the question. All right. Our year so far has been defined by the global problem of coronavirus, and coronavirus and climate change actually have quite a bit in common. Like what? Like the fact that coronavirus is a global pandemic and so is climate change, but coronavirus is something that we experience locally, and so is climate change, right? In fact, when it comes to coronavirus, the things we care about, the health and safety of our families, our friends, our loved ones, and our communities, that's what coronavirus threatens, and that is exactly what climate change threatens too. So think back. I know this is hard, but think back to the beginning of March. I know it probably feels like 10 years ago at this point. Think back to the very beginning of March. Where were you and what were you doing? I'm not talking about the second or third week in March when everything started to shut down. I'm talking about the very beginning. Where were you and what were you doing? I know exactly where I was and what I was doing. I was packing to go to Ireland. When I travel, when I fly anywhere, I only travel in person if I have multiple events. So I have been collecting and organizing 18 different lectures and meetings and events and panels, 18 different events to do in Ireland in 11 days. And I was packing the beginning of March to leave. And my husband, who follows the news a lot more closely than I do, my husband said, well, I see that there's a headline. I was leaving on the 3rd. He said there's a headline saying there's 6 coronavirus deaths in the United States, and they're talking about what's happening over in China. Do you really think that you should go to Ireland? And I, of course, being from Toronto, we've had SARS scares there before. I said, oh, it will be fine. No worries. Famous last words, right? So I packed my bag, I went off to Ireland. I actually managed to do half of the 18 events, but this picture here at Queen's University in Belfast was my last normal day. 2 days after that, the entire country of Ireland had shut down. They made it illegal to travel more than 2 kilometers from your home, and I was thankfully on a plane heading back to the US. Luckily, I was able to make it back in before they closed the borders. So just, 10 days before, less than 10 days before, we had been thinking of coronavirus as a global issue, but not a local issue. And in terms of climate change, we're doing exactly the same thing. In fact, in terms of climate change, we are at the end of February and the beginning of March, so to speak. We know that at the global level, our carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are at their highest level in not just 650,000 years. I actually updated this map. This is a really cool map called Hot Numbers from Esri. I updated this map because you know what? It's 15 million years now. We also know that our average temperature has increased by almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius. We know that Arctic sea ice is going down year after year after year. We see headlines like Greenland and Antarctica are melting 6 times faster than in the 1990s. Methane emissions continue to rise. And of course, these days, wildfire, how climate change is affecting wildfires around the world. So we are, in fact, in the first week in March, so to speak, when it comes to climate change. What was happening in the first week in March? We already had coronavirus cases in the US. In fact, we had a lot more than we knew. It turns out we'd had them since at least January, if not before. We already had 6 deaths. There was already an outbreak in Seattle and in California before I was leaving for Ireland. But we were still thinking of coronavirus as a distant issue in space. It matters to people over there, but not here, and a distant issue in time. It's not affecting us now. Yes. But in fact, it was. In the first week in March, coronavirus was already here. It was already spreading across the United States. It was already infecting people in the places where we live. We just didn't realize it yet.
Yes.
And so we didn't have much time. We only had a little bit of time to act in a very decisive way in order to avoid the worst of the impacts. That is exactly where we are with climate change today. We know that climate is changing. We know that humans are responsible, and we scientists have communicated this. 11,000 scientists wrote a letter last year saying there is a climate emergency. Scientists have been studying climate change caused by humans since the 1850s. Yes, we have known that our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that keep us warm enough for life, since the work of Joseph Fourier in the 1820s, but by the 1850s, Irish scientist John Tyndall and American scientist Eunice Foote had both realized that humans were increasing the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, and if we were increasing those levels, we were going to get warmer. By the 1890s, a Swedish scientist called Svante Arrhenius had calculated how much warmer the planet would get if we kept on digging up and burning coal, and then of course later oil and natural gas too. And by the 1930s, British engineer Guy Callender had actually measured how much the planet had warmed since 1880, so in the last 50 years. So we have been sharing the global information for 150 years. So what's the problem? Why aren't we acting? Well, by now you can probably guess, right? The problem is that we still think of climate change as a global issue instead of as a local issue. That's the problem. And so just like coronavirus at the end of February and beginning of March, just like then, we're thinking of it as a far off issue, so we're not doing anything about it. We're still going on life as usual. We're still saying, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. But in fact, it's already here and it's already now and it's already affecting us today. And the window of time to take decisive action is closing fast. Now, this isn't just my opinion. I'm going to show you data that shows that this is the case. Ready? Here we go. This is from the Yale Program on Climate Communication. You can go there, actually, Christine, if you don't mind, Google Yale Climate Opinion Maps, and the link will pop up. And if you don't mind dropping that into the chat, that way people can click on it if they're interested. Just Google Yale Climate Opinion Maps. These maps have asked people across the country a bunch of different questions, about 30 different questions. And the first question they asked is, do you think global warming is happening? It turns out 72% of people would say yes. Now, if a county is orange, these are counties here, that means more than 50% of people said yes. And the darker the color, the more people said yes. So around Chicago, you can see it's a little bit darker. That means more people are saying yes. Compared to down further south in Illinois, it's a little lighter. That means less people are saying yes there. You can also show these maps by congressional district, which is very interesting. So here we have 72% of people say yes, global warming is happening. And so it's like in March, you'd ask people, you know, is coronavirus happening? People would say, yes, it's happening. Do you think it will harm plants and animals? 71% say yes, plants and animals. Do you think it will harm future generations? In other words, people in the future? 71% again say yes. Do you think it will harm people in developing countries? We're starting to see a little bit lower numbers here, but it's still overall, yes. People are saying overall it will harm people in developing countries. Do you think it will harm people in the United States? Well, now we're down to 61%. You're seeing there's a couple of blue counties in there, not just a couple, but quite a few, even in Illinois. But the country's still mostly orange. Okay, so it's real. It's going to affect plants and animals, future generations, people in developing countries, other people in the United States. And then they ask this question. What do you think the next question is? Do you think it will affect you? All of a sudden, it is blue across the whole country, almost the whole country. If you look carefully, there's a little bit of pale orange by Chicago. So Chicago is basically 50-50. Then also there's some counties that have high populations of Hispanic, Catholics, and Native Americans. Those are the two most concerned people groups in the United States about the impacts of a changing climate. But other than that, pretty much the rest of us are no. So why is that? It's because we think it's a distant issue. We think it's distant in time. It will affect people in the future, but not today. We think it's distant in space. It will affect people who live over there, but not people who live here. And we also think it's distant in terms of relevance. It will affect things that matter to other people, but not things that matter to me. And honestly, I think the biggest reason for that has nothing to do with the science and everything to do with the art of this. because whenever we see a movie poster or a book cover or a advertisement or something, a website about climate change, what are the images we see? I'm going to ask you this. So get out, poll everywhere. Ready? What's the first picture or the first image that jumps into your head when I say global warming? If you're using more than one word, make sure that you join that word with a dot or a dash, okay? What's the first picture that jumps into your head when I say global warming? All right. Yes. The number one image, if you survey people, the number one image that jumps into people's head when you say global warming for the last decade or so has been the one you see right in the middle here, polar bears. Now, I'm not going to survey you and ask you how many people have seen polar bears in real life, because probably very few of us have seen polar bears in real life in the wild. And I know there's a few people from California on the call, but if you're not from California or Oregon or Washington State, if you're from Illinois, you probably haven't seen wildfires near your house, right? But you have seen flooding. So things are starting to change, but for a very long time, ice shelves, ice sheets, icebergs, polar bears, ice melting, all of these words that we're seeing right here, these were the first things that popped into our head when we heard the words global warming. A polar bear sitting on a piece of ice, or if we saw pictures of people, the pictures of people would be of people who live far away from us. So again, right, we think people over there are being affected, but not people here. Not only that, but in terms of information, here's what neuroscientist Tali Sherratt says. I like to show you pictures of people so you see who they are too, not just me. She's a neuroscientist, and she talks about how our brains process information. And this is what she says. She says, our brains are programmed to actually get a kick out of information. We like information. We want information. But, and here's the but is, when we give people new information, they typically only accept it if they already believe it. If it contradicts what they believe, instead, their brain just, what? Shuts off. And then Dan Kahan is a social scientist who studies how people think about climate change. And he said, it's not people who know more science who are more concerned about climate change. In fact, the more science we know, we aren't more concerned, we're more polarized or split about this issue. Isn't that crazy? And in fact, Dan went on to do an experiment. And here's the experiment that he did. He developed a measure called ordinary science intelligence that were a bunch of sciencey questions he asked people to see how good they were at understanding data and understanding science. Now, of course, we know that's just one type of intelligence. There's many types of intelligence, but he was basically looking at, does a better understanding of science make you more worried about climate change? So he measured people's science intelligence, and then he asked them, is there solid evidence of recent global warming due mostly to human activity like burning fossil fuels? And he found there was a very weak correlation between their level of intelligence and the chances they would answer yes to this question. So you have a bit more of a chance. You know, if you're really smart, you have about 60% chance of answering this question correctly. And if you're really not so smart, you have about a 40% chance of answering this question correctly. That's not that big a difference from a 60 to a 40. But then he took this data set and he divided it in half based on one thing. The one thing was political affiliation. And this is what he found. He found that the smarter we are, the more we just cherry pick the information that we need to prove why we're already right, rather than changing our minds. So arguing over scientific facts like warming temperatures and melting ice just makes people more divided rather than bringing them together. And Tali Sherratt agrees. She goes on and she says, the wealth of information available to us in this information age we live on makes us more resistant to change, not less. because it's so easy to find data that supports our pre-existing opinion. And in fact, here's where it gets really scary. She said, in fact, as we are exposed to contradicting information and opinions, our polarization expands over time as people get more and more information. So in other words, just dumping more scary information on people about Greenland and Antarctica and polar bears and ice sheets and sea level rise, what that does is it creates a vicious cycle. And here is the cycle. So climate changes, we get worried when we see what's happening, right? We figure if this person isn't worried like we are, they don't understand how bad it is. So we share more scary data with them. But what happens is the way our brain works is when somebody shares more and more scary information with us, we just shut off. We reject it even more. And so the result is inaction. In fact, Sharot goes on, she says, fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw and to freeze and to give up rather than taking action. And so climate changes more. Now, again, what type of scary data are we usually talking about? We're usually talking about global data, not local data, right? Global temperature or wildfires in Australia or sea ice in the Arctic. We're not talking about local information. So how do we break this vicious cycle? Well, these maps that I showed you before, they've actually got the answer in them. Isn't this interesting? So this is where we left off. This is the last map you saw. Do you think global warming will harm you personally? And you can see most of the country is blue. No, but this is not the bluest map. There are two more maps that are darker blue than this one. And that's where we start to see the answer. So the Yale program on climate communication also asked, do you ever talk about global warming, even occasionally? And you can see Chicago now is blue. The whole country is blue. There's one county outside of San Francisco, and there's one county by Seattle, and those are the only orange counties in the whole country. On average, only 35% of people discuss climate change or global warming even occasionally. And wait, there's one more map that's even bluer. Can you guess what it is? Do you ever hear about global warming in the media? No. So at this point, you might be saying, Katharine, how is this a solution? It's because these things can be fixed. How is this a solution? We can talk about it. How do we break this vicious cycle? By sharing the right kind of information. Not information about the global problem that seems far away in space and time, but information about the local issues, things that matter to us in the places where we live. The real problems that we have when it comes to climate change is not that we're not smart enough to understand the science. We are. And unfortunately, the smarter we are, the better we are able to argue about it. Our real problems are that we don't think it matters to us, and we don't think there's anything positive that we can do to fix it. So this is what we need to be talking about. Why and how climate change matters to us personally, in the place where we live, in ways that matter to us, and all the positive things that we can do at the local scale to help fix it. Like what? Let me give you some examples. So I'm going to give you some examples of how we scientists do it poorly, and then I'm going to give you some examples of how we can do it well. Here we go. So here's a scientist. A scientist says sea level is rising. And we use a graph like this that shows all of these different colored lines in the future. And if you show this to somebody, global sea level rise depicted by a bunch of different colored lines, people will say, what is this and what does this have to do with my life? They would say, so what? And in answer to so what, I would say this. Rising seas are bringing water into our coastal communities at record rates. A picture of a house with a car and a sign saying no wake. Now, if you are a boater or a sailor, you know a no wake zone is something where you slow down to go through. You don't normally see no wake zones for cars. So this is very, all of a sudden we're seeing this sign that says no wake with a car, and we're saying, what does that mean? We're seeing that places like Miami Beach are raising the level of their streets by 2 feet to keep the streets dry. And this is a picture from a real estate blog. We see that sea level rise has already sunk property values by 1.6 billion in the Carolinas alone. And Florida coastal homes could lose 15% of their value by 2030 due to sea level rise. So what are we doing here? We're not using science to appeal to people. We're using stories. We're using images. We're using things that touch our heart, that show us things that are near to our home if we live along the coast, or if we know somebody who lives along the coast, or if we have a vacation property along the coast. Now, scientists like to talk about how the ocean is warming. And when we talk about that, we show figures like this, which show ocean heat content in joules times 10 to the 22. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't usually measure things in joules. Do you? Probably not. So you might look at this and you might say, so what? Here's so what. Because the ocean is warming, coral reefs are headed for massive deaths. Images, art installations, photographs, videos, documentaries, movies about the Great Barrier Reef and about our coral, like Chasing Coral, for example, if you've ever seen that documentary, it brings it home and it touches us in a way that's personal. We're seeing more toxic algae on the rise. We're seeing stronger hurricanes like Hurricane Sally. I was watching Hurricane Sally develop days ago, and I was watching the forecast saying that it was going to come ashore as a Category 1. And I said to my husband, and he can testify to this, I said, I don't believe that. Look at the warm ocean waters in the Gulf of Mexico. There's no way it's going to stay at a Category 1. Hurricanes feed off warm ocean waters. It's going to be a Category 2 before it comes ashore. And sure enough, it was. And we see this happening with hurricanes around the world. They are intensifying faster, fed by warm ocean water. They are getting bigger and stronger. They have a lot more rain associated with them, and they're slower too. In fact, Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston 3 years ago, we know that up to 40% of the rain during Hurricane Harvey would not have happened if that same hurricane had occurred 100 years ago, and that hurricane was 4 times more damaging because of a changing climate. Then we scientists like to talk a lot about how temperature is increasing, right? And we show figures like this with different colored lines, showing what will happen in the future depending on our choices. But why do we care about temperature? We care about it because of heat waves. Chicago had devastating heat waves in the 1990s, and that was part of the reason why the Chicago Climate Action Plan was put in place over 10 years ago now that I contributed to. Heat affects our health. It affects people who are already vulnerable, the very old, the very young, the very ill, people who can't afford to pay their power bill. We also know that heat affects wildfires. Climate change doesn't cause wildfires, but just think of it this way. Imagine a match falls into a pile of green wood. What happens? Not much. Now imagine a match falls into a pile of wood and kindling that has been dried out due to climate change. What happens? What happens is exactly what we are seeing out west today. Climate change doesn't cause wildfires, but once they ignite, primarily due to accidental human ignition, most wildfires in the Western US are accidental and they're ignited by humans. They burn much greater area thanks to what? Climate change. And then we know that heavy rainfall is increasing. And here we actually get some pretty maps to show how since the 1950s, we've already seen a 42% increase in heavy precipitation across the whole Midwest, including Illinois. But why does heavy precipitation matter? It matters because it causes what? Floods. And I don't know if you can remember, it's hard to remember all the way back to a year ago last March, a year and a half ago, but most of the Midwest was under a massive declaration of disaster due to floods. Why? Because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along, as they typically do during spring in the Midwest, there's more water vapor for that storm to pick up and dump on us today than there would have been 50 or 100 years ago. Why do we care about climate change? Not only because of the polar bears, but we do, or because of the ice sheets, although we do, or because of sea level rise or global temperature. We care about climate change because it affects the air that we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the safety of our homes, the vitality of our economies. It affects our health, just like coronavirus affects our health and air pollution affects our health. We care about climate change because of everything we already care about. So your turn now, ready? Go back to poll everywhere. Why do you care about climate change? I care about climate change because it affects what? Again, if you're going to use more than one word, make sure you use a dash or a dot, okay? You know how this works now, you've seen it. Why do you care about climate change? I care about climate change because it affects my health, because it affects marginalized communities more than anyone else, because it affects our children and our grandchildren, our future, our food, everything I love that one. Because it affects, and this is actually the perfect answer, it affects everything. It affects everything and everyone that we love. We don't care about climate change because of the images we're often presented with. We care about it because of what we already love and what we already care about in our hearts. So you already get this. You already understand. As the Prime Minister of Dominica said, he's the Prime Minister of one of those islands that was devastated during the hurricane season 2 years or 3 years ago. He said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. And when you think about that polar bear on the iceberg, that picture I showed you, the reality is this. When it comes to who's on the metaphorical piece of melting ice, it's us. We are the ones who are most at risk from the impacts of a changing climate right after the polar bear. The polar bear comes first and we are next. So the problems we need to tackle, going back to what we can do about this problem, are first of all the problem of psychological distance. We don't think it matters to us. We think it's far away from us in space or time or relevance. And the second problem we have is the problem of solution aversion. We don't think there's anything we can do to fix it other than destroying the economy and returning to the Stone Age. That's what a lot of people think. So how do we do this? Well, Chris is a researcher at my university and he studies this. And what he's found is absolutely fascinating. Do you remember I talked about how Tali Sharot said that when we throw more and more bad facts at people, it actually increases polarization? Remember she said that? Well, what Chris found is that when you show people how climate change matters to us in the places where we live, guess what happens? It reduces polarization. Now, this is very academic-y language over here. I'm sorry for that. But basically he said, when you talk about what's happening in Indonesia, people are very polarized over it. When you talk about what's happening in Illinois, all of a sudden people come together and they care about it. Why? Because we've brought it home. That's the difference. Isn't that interesting? So how do we actually do this? And we're going to be taking your questions at the end. So start thinking about your questions. You're going to be typing them into poll everywhere. But how do we actually do this? We address psychological distance by connecting climate change to something that we care about here, by connecting it to birding or cooking or impacts on the city of Chicago or farming or flooding or the security of our homes or the economy. And we overcome solution aversion by talking about real positive constructive solutions that we can implement here in the places where we live. Let me give you a few examples. So we can explain how climate change matters locally, not just globally. We can talk about flooding if we live in Illinois. We can talk about wildfires if we live in California or Oregon or Washington State or Alberta. We can talk about flooding if we live in Ontario or the Midwest. We can talk about hurricanes and sea level rise if we live in the Gulf Coast or Florida. We can talk about droughts if we live where I live in Texas. Climate change is making all of these events worse. It's not creating them, it's making them worse, much more harmful and much more damaging. But we also have to talk about solutions. And there's so much good news. We can talk about how industry is leading the way with solutions. And if you notice the dates on these headlines, they're actually quite old. Industry is leading with solutions. In the state where I live, we already have 20% of our electricity from clean energy sources. The biggest army base in the US is in Texas, and they've been powered by wind and solar energy for the last 2 years. Why? To save taxpayers $150 million. That's pretty cool news. We can talk about solutions, obviously, in Illinois, from the city's Green Roof program, which helps to reduce the urban heat island effect and save energy, to the fact that the Morton Arboretum has suggestions of which trees to plant now that will be native to Illinois in 50 years as climate changes, to things like the Field Museum's Field Guide to Climate Action, to things like the Illinois Solar Tour. There are all kinds of local solutions that we can talk about. We can talk about solutions that are being implemented by faith communities, which is fantastic. We can talk about solutions that are being implemented by unexpected people and places around the world, places where people don't even have access to electricity of any kind, kids who are creating new ways for us to get energy. There's so many good news stories, and these stories can be communicated in so many different ways. Like what? How do we communicate these stories? Not by making scientific charts and data and reports, but by using our creativity to spread the news. So for example, stand-up comedy on climate change. Yes, people are doing that. In fact, I'm actually participating in not as a comedian, but as a scientist in one of these for Climate Week next week. An artist like Jill Pelto, who takes scientific data, like you're looking at right in the middle, and turns it into art. She was actually on the cover of Time magazine a couple of weeks ago. People who tell stories. You could be telling stories to a group like this man here, or you could be telling stories individually. People who take information like the warming stripes that tell us how temperature has changed in the place where we live. There's a stripe for every year. If it's blue, it's colder than average. If it's red, it's warmer than average. And they turn the warming stripes into masks or into knitted scarves or blankets or into leggings that they wear, or people who do art installations like this art installation here where they took pieces of ice and put them in the middle of Paris during the climate conference so people could actually see what Greenland ice looked like as it melted. When it comes to communicating why climate change matters and what we can do to fix it, every single one of us has something to contribute, and we don't have to be a scientist. In fact, we're probably better at it if we're not a scientist, because I gave you examples of how scientists communicate, and they're great to communicate to other scientists, but they're not great to communicate to non-scientists with. So the first step to talking about climate change is to talk about it, to communicate about it, and it matters. Matthew Goldberg is a communication researcher, and he found that when we talk about global warming with our friends and our family, people learn more information. When they learn more information, they're more concerned about it, and when they're more concerned about it, they talk about it more. So instead of being the vicious cycle we looked at before, the bad one, where climate changes, we're worried, we share more scary data, people reject it even more, they just turn off, and inaction results because we freeze. Instead of this, instead, a positive feedback cycle where climate changes, right? We're worried, yes, but then we break the cycle. We share how climate change affects us in the places where we live in ways that matter, number one. And we also talk about positive constructive solutions. So people feel engaged and they feel empowered. Action results. That's how we break the vicious cycle. Not by doing more science, not by spreading more bad scientific news about what's happening at the poles or the far ends of the earth, but by talking about how climate change affects us here and now. So that's why when I was asked 2 years ago now to plan a TED Talk, I said, I want to do a TED Talk on the most important thing anyone can do about climate change. And they said, we already have a TED Talk on changing your light bulbs. We already have TED Talks on recycling. We already have TED Talks on eating less meat and vegan diets and electric vehicles. And I said, sure, I know that, and I'm not an expert in those things. I want to do a TED Talk on what I believe is the single most important thing that anybody can do about climate change. And that is to talk about it in a positive, constructive way. Because as Tally says, the human brain is built to associate a forward action with something positive. So we need to reframe our message so that we provide hope, not dread. How do we do that? We do it by explaining why climate change matters to us here and now and positive ways that we can work together to fix it. So that's what I did. I made a TED Talk on the most important thing you can do to fight climate change is talk about it. And this was not my TED Talk. So if you want more, go ahead and watch my TED Talk. In fact, Christine, if you don't mind Googling it, just Google TED and my name, and you can pop the link right into the chat there so people can click on it if they want. That's why I did my TED Talk on this, because I truly am convinced it is the single most important thing that any one of us can do. And when I say talk, for some of us, it could be literally using our voice to talk. For some of us, it could be making something. It could be sharing something. It could be posting something. Expressing ourselves to other people is the single most important thing that we can do, not hitting them upside the head with more dread and more fear, but showing them, connecting from the heart, showing them why it matters and what we can do to fix it. Thank you so much. It has been great talking with you today. Thank you for hanging in.